$25,000 earnest money deposit. Good idea? What's up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Simranpreet Saini with Century 21, your local real estate agent. Now, today I'll be talking about one of the more important and often misunderstood parts of buying a home, the earnest money deposit. Now, depending on the situation, the earnest money deposit can become a main sticking point during the deal. And so, to help you understand what earnest money is and what happens to it in certain situations, I'll be running you guys through a few hypothetical scenarios. Now, before we begin, I am not a licensed attorney nor a licensed accountant. So, these scenarios are simply here to give you an idea of what may happen to the earnest money deposit. Please consult the appropriate professional services for in-depth inquiries. So, what is earnest money? Well, earnest money is an amount of money that is paid by the buyer, which is then placed into an escrow account within the time frame governed by the real estate purchase contract, or Rep C for short. Now, this sum of money is most commonly 1% of the home price, but really it can be any sum of money. So, does that mean that you should put as high of an earnest money deposit as possible to show you have a ton of good faith on purchasing the home? Absolutely not. As I will discuss, earnest money is not just a mere show of good faith to buy the home. It can be a major risk to both buyer and seller if not handled properly. Throughout the Rep C, there should be sections outlining what happened to the earnest money deposit in certain situations. Now, again, these situations I'm about to share with you are mere hypotheticals and should not be taken as legal advice as to what will actually happen. So, say we have a buyer and after months of painstaking searching, we have found the home of their dreams. So, they call me up and I help them write the offer to purchase the home for, let's say, $400,000 with a $25,000 earnest money deposit to really show the seller that we are super serious about buying the home. Now, of course, I would definitely make sure they knew what they were getting into by making that $25K decision. But of course, for this situation, let's just say they did. And so the seller is impressed and agrees and accepts our offer. So I go ahead and we submit our $25K deposit into the escrow account. Now, during the due diligence phase, the buyer finds that the roof has a major leak in it. So we reach back out to the seller and try to renegotiate. But the seller has refused to repair the roof and won't even give us any credit to repair the roof ourselves. And so, the buyer wants out of the deal. They want to cancel the Rep C. Well, if they cancel the Rep C, what happens to that $25,000 sitting in the escrow account? Now, if we haven't passed the due diligence deadline, we should be able to cancel the contract, get back our $25K, and walk away. Now, this is before the due diligence deadline. So if the due diligence deadline has passed, that $25K is not refundable. So be extra clear about what the timeline looks like. Now let's rewind a little bit and let's say that the buyer didn't find anything wrong with the home and it's in pristine condition, and so we move on through the timeline. So we are now in the next phase after the buyer's due diligence phase. And now it is time for the lender to step up and finalize the loan terms of the buyer. So the bank's appraiser comes out to the property and appraises the property. Now let's say that the appraisal comes in for lower than the purchase price. So now, generally speaking, two things can happen. The buyer can elect to cover the cost in the gap between the purchase price and what the bank is willing to give and cover that distance, and we move on through the timeline. Or the buyer can elect to cancel the contract, take the earnest money back, and walk away. Again, the outcome of that scenario is dependent specifically on the terms of the contract that you are using. So be sure to read it and make sure you know what happens in that situation. Now, let's say that the buyer doesn't cancel the contract just because the appraisal came in lower than expected. So they go back to their lender to renegotiate the terms of their loan. Now here is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Let's say that the buyer honestly and fairly tried to renegotiate the terms with their lender, and alas, they weren't able to come to a consensus to where the buyer is satisfied with their loan terms. And so they decide to notify the seller in writing that they are canceling the real estate purchase contract. In this case, the earnest money deposit of $25,000 can be gained back by the buyer and they can leave. Or they could take back a certain percentage of the $25,000 and give the remaining percentage to the seller. So potentially speaking, the buyer could take back all $25,000 or, give $20 to the seller as a show of goodwill. So far, it might seem like this whole earnest money situation is really weighed a lot towards the buyer, where it's giving the buyer a lot of advantages with little risk. But that is not 100% true. So what happens if the buyer isn't satisfied with their loan, but the appraisal and financing deadline has passed and they didn't cancel in time? Well, the buyer may not be forced to buy the home, giving them the chance to walk away, but that earnest money deposit may be released to the seller in the form of liquidated damages. So, the seller may receive all $25,000 of that earnest money and the real estate purchase contract is canceled. Again, another reason to be very sharp and clear on your deadlines. Now, of course, it's not always that cut and dry, especially when you consider when either buyer or seller defaults. Defaulting meaning that the defaulting party has made some sort of egregious mistake. Now, generally speaking, there may be three possible outcomes to either the buyer defaulting or the seller defaulting. In the case of buyer default, meaning the buyer has made some sort of mistake, the seller may have three options to choose from. The first being that the seller takes the earnest money in the form of liquidated damages and cancels the purchase. The second being that the seller doesn't take the earnest money and specifically enforces the buyer to go through with the purchase. Or the third one being that the seller gives back the earnest money to the buyer and goes after some other form of remedy. In the case of seller default, the buyer may have these three options to choose from. The buyer may elect to cancel the purchase, take back their earnest money, and take back an additional sum equal to that earnest money. Meaning in our little scenario, the buyer can cancel the purchase, take back their $25,000 that they had in earnest money in the escrow account, and demand from the seller that they pay an additional $25,000 in the form of liquidated damages. And the second option is that they don't take any of the earnest money out, and they specifically enforce the purchase. They force the seller to carry on with the purchase. And the third option is that they take back their earnest money, and they pursue some other form of remedy on top of that. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, you should be more prepared and aware of what could possibly happen during a transaction, specifically in regards to earnest money. Now you know that the thing that is referred to as a simple show of good faith is not very simple after all. Again, I am not a licensed lawyer nor a licensed accountant, and none of what I said should be taken as legal advice. In fact, you should be extra careful to make sure you read through the purchase contract that you are using. And as always, if you have any further questions or you need help on your transaction, feel free to reach out, call, text, email, and I will be happy to help you out.